Mark this moment in time, she said, because we have these moments in time every day. We kind of get used to different things that happen in our lives, and we've all been through a big, huge game changer in the last 4 years called COVID. I'm hoping that some of you actually wrote some of your reactions, or if you were numb, you at least did something later on and tried to get a reaction or two out of some of your relatives. Hopefully, I know most all of us remember this, unless we have someone younger than 24. But the Twin Towers are something that are in our brains. And we've been through that. We all had our reactions at the time. And it was another real game changer for us. So where were you on that infamous day, September 11, 2001, when the towers were struck and thousands were killed? Well, I was in Kamloops, British Columbia on vacation, in a hotel, and watching the TV as it happened. For the nearly 5 days that we had to remain in British Columbia before we were allowed past the border again into the United States, we were treated ever so kindly by those wonderful Canadians. But it did take us many days before we could go home across the border. And we discovered when we went across the border that the most important thing there that they wanted to see was our luggage, and they didn't care about the vaccinations for our two dogs. The two dogs could stay in the truck, but we couldn't. Well, we were numb that day watching TV as that second plane struck, and I did have a brief diary entry reading, "The U.S. was attacked. We're in shock. Who did this? Why?" I got one phone home to our daughter across the border before the circuits were so tangled that we could do no more. She was living down in Florence, Oregon by herself, so I was very concerned, working for an online magazine and teaching part-time at a college. She didn't have any relatives near her, so I reassured her as to what was going on because she was not a news hound. So she was very uneasy and anxious, and I did give her a way to get to her aunt in Montana so she'd have someone and not be worried about us. All three of my brothers were in Montana watching TV, just like Bob and I were. My sister was in Seattle with her daughter and a son. They all called, I should say. We didn't, because I couldn't, but they all called one another over the next few days. When I got back across the border, I could reassure them and tell them the adventure that we'd had as we had to change from hotel to hotel and go on with our seemingly non-vacation as we just waited time out. I'd like to remind you that it was mind-blowing and changing for all of us. Here's the things we still have today. Getting across the border. Protocols changed immediately, and they've not returned to what they were before. Air travel protocols changed when we finally got a chance to get back on an airplane. Our travel documents changed, what we needed, what those looked like. And that air of unease settled in. It still lingers. Hopefully our sense of togetherness for those months still lingers. Sometimes I wonder, but this is a kind of mind-blowing event that I write about in my diary and that I tried to get my family to participate in our private chats so that we all have a chance to know one another a little better, and we all have a chance to see how we have responded. I have those responses from people, and it's already been well over time for 24 years ago. It's very interesting. How did your family react? How did the community around them react? When mind-blowing events occur, we react. One of our first reach outs is probably going to be to immediate family or to our bosses if we're working or trying to figure out where we're going to travel when we have something like that 1980 volcano out in Washington that definitely affected us in Montana. But it's been ever thus. I want to remind you, our ancestors were just like us. When confronted with such an event, they also reacted, and they also sent their reactions to that event down through other generations, hopefully. So finding out how ancestors reacted can add a great deal to your family story. I'm just going to say, do it. Pick a day in your life. Maybe it's something where there was an actual trauma in your life where my grandfather suffered the death of 5 of his siblings in one car accident when he was in his 60s. I can remember that moment. And remember what life was like for him afterwards. He told me he was very lonely. Today, we're talking about capturing life-changing events in your story. You know, we all do births, deaths, marriages. We follow censuses. We find people we did not expect to find just because we follow those censuses and we follow other things that happen in the news. But for instance, the 9/11 event, take time, write a brief paragraph. Where were you? Share it with someone else in your family and see if you get a response back. Hopefully you do. Or for goodness sakes, if you're at a family reunion and time lags, which I know it doesn't in family reunions, you might all pick a day or a time and reminisce a little bit around that campfire about where you were. Hopefully somebody has their small recorder out and can get it recorded for everyone. COVID in March 2020. I'll never forget the day we had to close the library here. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. I was a senior in high school, the editor of the school paper. I wrote about it. I can remember our feet on the heavy gravel at Polson High School as the principal called us outside and lowered the flag. When the U.S. put a person on the moon in 1969, that was a fun day for me. I happened to be finishing my very last undergrad class, and I was done with my several years of college. There was an itty bitty TV in the journalism school that we watched. It was pretty cool. That Yellowstone earthquake of 1959, I was just 13, almost 14-year-old, working at the Kelly Evans Summer Estate, and I slid all the way across the floor in the little cabin that I was in because it was constructed on ties and the ties moved. When the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in New York City on October 26th in 1886, my family was very, very aware of that. As a matter of fact, my grandma, Nanny Lee, actually came into the country that day, along with 5 siblings and her mother. What a day that must have been. I got to tell you, though, that they came in down at Baltimore, but they still would have heard about that on the train as they climbed on the train and went off to Minnesota. And one that we may not be aware of, but gives you a real opportunity to think about your generations, say 7 or 8 generations, maybe 9 generations a year ago, and that is the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia on May 6th in 1816, because the eruption continued for quite some time. When I think of the day or week about 9/11, I'm still traumatized by what I saw. I can still see these things. I can capture the stories and my reactions. It wasn't easy, but I did write some brief reactions in my diary, which I shared later with my family. And I finally made that inevitable thing for me. You guys know me. I'm going to make a timeline with my reactions, and then I'm going to add things if somebody will give me a reaction. I've had reactions from my nieces, Amy and Alicia, and I had a reaction from my sister, Susie. So that was fun for me to get that. I shared my anxieties about it and my story with my siblings. They wanted me to write their stories. I said, hey, I want you to share. Don't think I'm going to write everything. Hopefully, you'll get your siblings and your family to share too. Because our families of yesteryear had reactions and shared them. So even if we don't have their letters, we don't have their personal reminiscences, we may have pictures. We can get an idea of how our families and their fan club, that is, those friends and neighbors and acquaintances, reacted to a mind-blowing event like World War II. We can use newspapers and videos and still shot photos and social media so we can write about it, even if it happened in the past and we're trying to get a gander on what happened then. We're separated from ancestors by generations across time, but they have stories to share if you'll get into their lives through the social media they had at that point. Imagine living through a summer of snow, which is what happened a year later in 1816 after Mount Tambora erupted a year before that, because all of that terrible, terrible eruption shared itself across most of the world. And we had what was called a consuming winter and a summer of snow in the United States. About the only place in what is the United States today that didn't share that particular thing was that Alaska territory that would be coming to us 50 or 60 years after 1816. Hey, take a chance and check out your relatives in the past against this non-summer event. What did the news say? I know that in Pennsylvania, where my Cogleiser family lived, they had a tough time growing a garden because the frost was pretty constant. The sun wasn't around very much, and the temperature went down just enough that they didn't get the days that they needed for growing time. Most places got 30 to 50 days of growing time, and it simply wasn't enough. If you are in a culture where you are raising your own food, that can be a real problem. It's a problem for the animals, a problem for the people, and a problem for governments trying to figure out what to do. That Indonesian 1815 eruption was the most powerful that we know of volcanic eruption in our recorded history. It lasted from April 5 through July 15, with the real peak event exploding on May 15. No time for people to leave, thousands, of course, dying all at once. And it was a significant global climate effect, producing that year without a summer a whole year later. There were widespread crop failures in Europe and in England and in Ireland, famine, producing, of course, that thing that joins with famines frequently called disease. So don't just think that it was one or two things. 10 to 11 deaths from direct volcanic effects just right in those Indonesian islands, but 49 to 90,000 deaths from those post-eruption famines and epidemics and diseases on all of the islands. They literally almost stuffed out life in that place, in that area of what we call today Indonesia. That year without summer in the northeastern United States, we experienced temperature drops, crops failed. There was constant frost in Maine and Vermont. Massachusetts had a great deal, and the mid-Atlantic states suffered a great deal in terms of the life of the growing season, all the way down through North Carolina. I have reactions. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't reactions other places. It just means that that's what I was able to pick up in newspaper accounts. Canada was also affected. In June 1816, they had 12 inches of snow on the ground in Quebec. No crops. I'm telling you. India had 3 years of crop failures because of this, and famine followed with typhus and cholera. It was a 6-year sweep for them. In the British Isles, there were heavy, heavy acidic rains causing failed crops, even if they had a growing season. And there was a total famine in Wales. If you want to take a look at this, you can do a fast look out at Wikipedia. Just put in Tambora eruption 1815. If you want to see some other fun things from the Farmer's Almanac, you can go out to the wild weather events in the summer of 1816. Just throw that into your Google lines, because you're going to see how May frost killed off most of the crops, and they couldn't get seed planted in time to make a difference. They tried, but the crops were immature, so they didn't get very much off them. In Cape May, New Jersey, frost was reported 5 nights in a row in late June, and it totally took their crops. They couldn't cover up enough. There was lake and river ice observed as far south as northwestern Pennsylvania. Frost reported as far south as Virginia at the end of August. And rapid and dramatic temperature changes occurred frequently as the skies darkened and then lightened again, and some of the dust went away, and then it came back. U.S. grain prices immediately quadrupled. Oat prices increased almost 8-fold. And there were famines and riots and arson and looting occurring in Eastern European cities. So when you're going to consider something like that, start with yourself and your family. I could and did write a letter to a person in my family several generations back in Norway, finally explaining how bad I felt once I realized what it was to lose a child. And this woman had lost a 2-year-old, an 8-year-old, and an 11-year-old, all in one bout over several weeks when someone came into their community with smallpox. That's a different context once you finally realize later on that those deaths are very real in your family, and they produce very real reactions for your family. In my Beck story in Norway, then, I've written a letter to this woman expressing how I was finally able to feel about the losses she and her mother and her husband and grandparents felt when they lost those kiddos. And by the way, that same community lost very few in other places because the person with smallpox had come to their place first. What a bummer. So you can establish multiple contexts, person by persons, for a certain day or date. Look for the local weather if you can find it, because that's going to be reported from about the 1780s forward in newspapers. So you're going to have a chance to see what the weather was like if you have newspapers online for that era. If you don't, then you need to get out and begin to look at some of the other free sites online. Always include the ages of family members so that your family has an opportunity to see not just that it affected the family, but who was affected and who carried that particular loss or concern for the next many years of their lives. Because communities have layers of connections. Don Dillman, the book that I've just been recently reading, it's his reminiscence of his life as a person who has worked a great deal with questionnaires and with recording places concerned with censuses, said it is helpful to know who was connected to whom in the past and the circumstances surrounding the connections. Now, I can reflect back to that by just thinking of Ferndale, Montana. When I go there to that little community that I've been writing about, I'm no longer afraid to stop someone who's at their mailbox and ask, for instance, if they know who lives in the Rella Ralston house, because I'm confident that if they've lived there more than a few years, they know that that house is the closest to the new Ferndale store today. If they're not familiar with Rella, I can always say, you know, that older house that's down there in South Ferndale that's very close to the Ferndale store. Oh. And they may give me that connection so that I at least have a name when I go contact that person. People in the past helped neighbors, and we discovered through the traumas we've been in with COVID and with things like 9/11 that the community also helps one another then. It's an opportunity for us to adjust to people's problems and peculiarities and say, well, I guess the peculiarity or I don't like his attitude too well about something. But when things happen that affect us like that, we discover just how important it is to get along and take extra steps to be kind, to be thoughtful, to begin to think of how those people are reacting because, hey, they're just like you and me. So read the newspapers, especially, and read the meeting minutes. I know I've discovered fun stuff when I read the city council meeting minutes for Great Falls, Montana, and discovered how council members of the teens back when felt about people as they really talked about local problems and local people. Kind of interesting. You might be reading things like Farm Bureau meeting reports, or for me, the fire department meeting minutes in Ferndale. So, and the women's club there, and the gossip columns, and especially the school news, because they're all layers of connection to people in the past, and they're vital for your research. They really can help you. It's going to add just so much to the stories that you tell. Culture has a way of seeping in and becoming part of life in any communities. And when people join a community, they bring their culture with them, but they also become acculturated within that community. So ask the locals about people of yesterday in the community. I can still say, what can you tell me about Leon Nelson's parents? Or what can you tell me about my grandpa, Oscar Lee? And get a reaction from people, even if they say, well, I came after he did, after Oscar, but I certainly heard about his terrible driving tactics, because believe me, that has lingered in the community of Ferndale. People there may recite who lived where and when and stuff that happened and what continued to happen. And sometimes that can be even your entry as you begin to talk to people in the community that you're not familiar with. But be aware that there are places where generational continuity might seem kind of ghostly as people say, well, I've heard about that. I heard a story, but I'm not sure if the story I heard is true. But you're going to find that the stories about your families and about long ago are still embedded in a community personality of type because some people stayed there and the stories continued. There's just nothing better than being able to talk about people of the past. Sometimes it's a horror story about a person, and sometimes it's just a fun story about something that happened to someone. But if you take the time to engage, then you're going to find that they will engage with you. Don't be afraid to approach those people. By the way, you can get the Farmer's Almanac news online free daily. Sometimes it's enough for me just to get it once a month or twice a month. So I don't keep it up as a feed, but you can go out to the Farmer's Almanac. It's just called almanac.com. And for instance, get how the weather changed history on a particular day for yourself. If you're looking at family and saying, hey, what was the weather like on the day I was born in Kalispell, Montana? Or what was the weather like on the day of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906? For many of our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, World War II started with a mind blower on December 7, 1941 for the United States, because that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese. Here's what we saw in the Great Falls Tribune. The Japs bomb Hawaii and Manila bases. Hey, we've heard so much about Hawaii that somehow we kind of forgot about Manila. And there were things like in this extra thing, Roosevelt issuing as a president his undisclosed orders to the U.S. Army and Navy, and where the Japanese bombers struck, what we knew at that point, and the terrible toll of people, of course. In the Great Falls Leader, which was another paper right here in Great Falls, the big E was war declared with 3,000 U.S. victims in the Great Falls Leader. Uh, and so, and they gave a nice little thing in this newspaper. If you notice, they said, okay, it was midnight in Europe when this newspaper was printed. So they were trying to give you the idea of what was happening in Europe and some other places. You'll get neat ideas about what to put into your story. So where were your families at the start of World War II? Make a list. Where was your dad? Where was your mom? Grandparents or aunts, uncles, your kissing cousins and your friends and acquaintances, those neighbors, the church members, maybe. What did the woman on the street say in the local newspaper? What happened there? Uh, you're going to find plenty of things. And I'm going to tell you that newspapers from about 1860 on through about 1970, 1980 are positively rich with local neighborhood columns. You're going to discover that in those columns and adjacent to those columns, you'll have things like who got in a list, who got admitted to the hospital the day before, who stayed in the hotels the day before within a town. So there's lots for you to consume there as you begin to realize that the news was very different in that time stretch of about 120 years. People did not fear to talk locally about what was going on and who was doing it. My immediate family, December 7 and 8 in 1941, I know the one thing my dad said was they were glued to the radio in his dad's house at Oscar Lee in Ferndale, because Oscar had the only radio for about a half a mile along around. So Oscar, who was 62, and my grandma, who was 65, and my parents, who were 29, and my two brothers, Con and Gary, were there with their cousins Jim and Len. My dad's siblings, on the other hand, were various places. Louise was 34, married and in Havre. Merle was 28 and married. She was in Helena. Orrin was 27 and over here in Nyhart. I didn't know that. That was neat to find out. Engvald Beck, Inky Binky, my other grandparent, was 60, a widower in Havre, and he still had one kid in his household. Bev was 15 and a student at Havre High School. But my mom's other four siblings, I should say, were married and living in Havre, and they had their own lives to lead. It was helpful to know where they were because they were going to be contacting one another. And at that point, I can tell you, no one in my family had a telephone. We had the radio. We had places to go. And Grandpa, Oscar, went into Kalispell and found a telephone where he could phone and get Louise, his daughter, who was on a Mountain Bell telephone board at that point, so he could talk to her and find out what was happening in Havre. So what did the Havre newspapers say? Here's their title: U.S. and Japs are at war. Just the day after, when war was actually being declared at that point. The Daily Interlake said the U.S. and Great Britain declare war and Japanese inflict heavy damage in the Pacific. These are all on December 8th. So you begin to get a different idea. They were not all using the same headlines, nor were they reporting the same stories. In Kalispell, the mayor proclaimed an emergency and said he was just saying, here it is, we have a national emergency and here's what I'm asking you to do. Assist in planning the defense of your community quietly and calmly. Report suspicious characters, any attempts to destroy property. Register at the city or in your community locally as a volunteer fireman and a volunteer patrolman to help us. We need that help. And register all firearms which could be made available in case of need. So you see, there was even a different view about firearms. Not a thing there at all about you're taking my firearms away, but they wanted to know where they were, so they had availability. Let's move on now to diseases and epidemics. If you don't know very much about an epidemic and its effect locally, get news articles, memoirs, or investigate the diseases themselves. When I look at the newspapers in Great Falls Montana, and in Helena, and in Billings, Missoula, Seattle, for the era of 1900 through 1910, you're going to get an idea, get a great idea of what epidemics were going on. Whether we called the deaths of those babies summer flu, it was more than that, or whatever. But you can read diaries and you can search out movies, if nothing else, or read the town histories and the immediate impacts. But you're going to make your story better if you begin to explain the true facts of what was going on in your community. It's 1906 when we first have Food and Drug Act action in our country. So don't get the idea that before that all was really well, because food poisoning affected many of your families, depending on what they did with that food and how they cooked it or didn't cook it. I'm going to give you my reactions on March 5, 2020. I was so sad. To my family out on Facebook, I said, well, I'm going to be working from home beginning Monday when our Great Falls Genealogy Society library and the third floor Montana room will voluntarily close because of corona threats in Montana. The library has said they cannot have volunteers in the library because of that corona threat. I got plenty to do at home, not housework, you know me, but I've got lots of indexes I can create and just staying safe. And I am so happy our city is acting responsibly regarding senior health. I was thinking about my sister because she was actually right out in the little community in Washington where we first got the first COVID deaths. Yep, right out there, living just 15 blocks from that health center. So say, do some of you remember the Mount St. Helens eruption on May 18 in 1980? I was a curriculum director here in Great Falls, and I remember being called by my boss not to go to work because the governor had closed Montana. So I spent the day glued to the news, and I spent time immediately figuring out grade level lesson plans that teachers could use to take advantage of the event. After all, I mean, it was a weather event. Let's make classes for each and every one of those grade levels. By the way, on my lawn, I had about an inch of ash and the sky stayed gray. I did get a response from one of my relatives, Ethel. She said that her sons were camping at Greenwater. They lived out at Washington, by the way, by Mount Rainier. And they saw blue sky before we did because the wind went the other way. She found her kids walking out on a logging road carrying a tire that was flat. So she got the tire fixed and went back, and they got home. She made them come home because they were young teens. And her car had about an inch of ash on it, even though the wind was going the other way. She said her folks back in Montana were camped out at Lake Inez, and they thought a big storm was moving in. It was a scary time for them. On another note, if you're thinking about our first big event with flu in October 1918 here in Montana, you can see that in one of the Butte newspapers, it says that the Butte Methodists and the miners were immune. Influenza seems to steer clear of them, but the butchers and the street cleaners were favored by flu. They were the ones who apparently reacted. There was news of a Dillon doctor taken by influenza, 5 deaths in Billings, and the day toll in Butte was reported in small letters. 22 persons died of Spanish influenza here today, and there are 245 new cases reported by 21 physicians. In Havre, there were all kinds of things. And of course, we had it in Great Falls. If you look at those papers in Great Falls beginning October 8, you're going to find out that we had about 50 deaths a day appearing in the obituary sections. And remember, those are just the ones where people had written at least a death notice or an obituary. That wasn't the full report. Great Falls was stunned and they tried their hardest. They were like everybody else. There are stories of by October 15, people earnestly and honestly going downtown together and scrubbing the streets because at that point they did not realize that that disease, that particular kind of influenza and its accompanying pneumonia were airborne. So adding context specifics like that can be helpful. You could add context specifics for the same time, but in a different place. I've told you earlier that in that 1816 event, what we know today as Alaska Territory wasn't affected. But boy, other places sure were. You could look at weather conditions in order to add those context specifics in newspapers, but you could also go out to a really neat site. All you have to do is put it in saying on this day in quotation marks out at Google, and you'll get some pretty neat things. AI will also tell you even more, but you need to watch it carefully because that has not been verified. Were there any disasters or diseases that you're aware of that your community ever experienced? What were the means of transportation and travel? You can find out by looking at the newspaper and the railroad timetables. When my grandma and her family came into the United States in October 1886, I could look at the railroad timetables in Maryland to see how they would be making that train from Pier 6 off their particular ship and getting on that train because it was all paid for in one ticket and going on their way to Minneapolis where they would be picked up. You can look at destination specifics by seeing the ship's manifests and the lists of ships coming into port. Go look at Boston's, go look at Quebec's, New York, various places. And remember, for heaven's sakes, that in the United States alone, people did not come in to the United States just through New York. If you look at destination specifics, you'll see that early on, by the 1820s, there were at least 14 active ports where we had people come in who immigrated to the United States. You can look at migration cards that were written up during WPA times during the Depression to see where people came in. There was a migration card for each one of my grandparents and their kids as they came into the United States. That was pretty thrilling because I could see variations in their names and I could see for sure what their age was. The October 28, 1886 was interesting for my family because they came in that day down in Maryland. That's the day that the Statue of Liberty was dedicated. So how about looking at your family on that day? Because the last rivet of the monument was fitted during a dedication presided over by President Cleveland. So you've got the president there. You can put that into your story. And numerous French and American dignitaries. If we looked at the New York Times on page 5, then they reported the Washington weather as pretty general. They said for New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Eastern New York, and Maine, generally fair weather, winds shifting to northerly, colder with a slight cold wave. Well, it was late October. So where were they? My family, if you notice in red, had arrived that day aboard the America. They're recorded as arriving on Pier 6 at the Baltimore Harbor in the ship America. Don't get excited. That ship was named over and over and over. I did manage to get a picture of it, but it had various monikers through the years. And that same day, in 1886, it's actually October 26 above, that family, Hedwig, the wife, and the 6 kids, can you imagine that, climbed on the train, and it was about a 3-day trip. My grandma wrote about it in her memoir. It was just a brief paragraph, but wow, was that neat. So what was the weather like in Baltimore that day? we know that the weather was northerly up in New York, where they were working with the weather there. The indications for 24 hours from 3 p.m. on for Delaware and Maryland were, again, local rains, winds shifting to northerly and cooler. So they had pretty much the same. But in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Minneapolis that same day, it was clear. That was 38 degrees and the wind was out of the west. So you can make some pretty different stories about it if you're just including even weather. So if you selected that same day, October 28, any year, you can go out to a site called onthisday.com and see all the events that are considered biggies that occurred on that particular day. Or you could go to weather.com online. You can do that every day and see what was going on. You can go to the wonderground.com and it only goes back in time to about 1930. So that's a little disappointing. You can go out to Cindy's list and also get her ideas of history on certain days and within timelines. And in any of your newspapers going all the way back to mid 1700s, you can see the weather for the current day. And frequently, even on Monday mornings in those newspapers, you could see what the weather was like for the past week. It's a pretty neat thing. Well, let's look at another event that we all should be aware of, or many of us anyway. On October 28, 1962, the Cuban missiles were withdrawn by Khrushchev, the Russian president at that point. I can remember that. I was in high school and it was a biggie in Montana because, of course, we had Kennedy's last little betting card against Khrushchev when he said, "We've got ours online right here in Montana and we'll be happy to come after you." I was a junior at Polson High School. I was living with my mom and dad. My sister Susie was living there. She was a newlywed. My brothers, Conley and wife, Ethel and son they were in Las Vegas. Yeah, I discovered that by talking to them. Ethel shared with me. My brother Gary was in the U.S. Army, and my brother Mike was at college in Havre. And I became a news nut that day in that 13-day standoff from October 16th to the 28th until we found out really quietly and a few days later that Khrushchev had removed the nuclear missiles in Cuba. And I had forgotten that his contention was that the US had placed nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, and he wanted those removed. Not all that happened. But our newspapers here in Great Falls, the Great Falls Leader, in the editorial column, here it is, on October 31, it says, "We were determined and Mr. K got the word. Naturally, we in this country and the free world will avoid cheering until we know for a fact that Soviet Premier Khrushchev has done what he promises, dismantle his Cuban missile bases and ship the missiles back to Russia." But what a neat event to be able to look at, even from today, because those of us who have traveled the roads out beyond Belt, Montana, know the signs that are out there as we see Kennedy's betting card, and it's referred to out there as the only missile that we actually had online. Hey, we were big and we were in the news. You can read biographies and memoirs. Hopefully your family wrote some. My grandma wrote, it wasn't 15 pages. It was probably more like 10. But my grandma Mary Nanick Lee, the one who came here as a 10-year-old, from Silesia, dictated a memoir to one of her grandchildren not long before she passed. And I've had that for quite some time. I've been able to share it with my closies, as I call them, at my private family Facebook site. And I get anywhere up to 30 people who were aware of her, who knew her, who have responded to that event. She came as a 10-year-old. They were admitted in October. It's just that grandma and her family came into the US down at Baltimore. That's always a bummer for my family, but they will snicker. I got them to read the story. Whenever I reread this story, you see, I can still hear my grandma's voice kind of in my mind's eye, and I can picture her saying it. I wish you would have known her. I wish my family would have known her. Uh, she was a pretty neat grandma, and she was the one who told me, you will be a teacher. Finding life-changing events of the past are a lot easier today because you can get a hold of newspapers. Most states have some of their statewide newspapers and other small community newspapers online for free. In Montana, you can go out to what is going to become the Montana Historical Society's site at newspapers and find all the newspapers that they have free. Once they're online and open, by the way, next November or so, they're going to have sites where all of you can go out and look at newspapers.com one at a time. They won't have, yeah, I predict that the place will be crushed at that point, but you're going to be able to pay to look at newspapers.com and not have to pay that half year at a time subscription in order to go out online. I admit it. I'm addicted to those newspapers, so I have my own subscription and I use it daily. But you can go out to find my list of newspapers available for all of Montana out at our gfgenealogy.com site. Just go to resources, pull down to the bottom to find the list of Montana, and take a copy for your desktop. It's there for you, and it's a freebie. It's, in fact, look at all of our resources. They're pretty well freebies there and good for you. Other newspapers you can use are the digitized Montana newspapers out at mths.montana.gov or out at Chronicling America, which is the Library of Congress site. Newspapers.com costs money. If you're looking at Havre, Hill County Library has done us a wonderful job of putting out all of their digital archives of all of their local newspapers, and it's free. And of course, you'll always find that thing that Google did almost 16 years ago now called Google News. They were only able to put out newspapers for a certain time, but they have maintained and they have not changed. You're still going to find that list of newspapers at my site, however, so you'll be able to go out there for free. So how did your ancestors and their community react to big events? Finding men and women on the street reactions are going to add significantly to your story, and sometimes some laughter too, especially when you see people who are characters, like my sister, and we were not aware of it, but she, honest to goodness, got the only driving or ticket that she ever got for not riding her motorcycle with a helmet on. That provided a lot of fun for her kids when they found that story. And it allowed them a common share of feelings across time while we all discussed the times we got pulled over by the cops for things that we had to admit it. Yeah, we did it. I'm going to challenge you to start by selecting 5 dates. They could be personal dates where you had personal tragedy in your family. Or they could be some of these that I've mentioned or other things you're thinking on in your lifetime that are important to you. And you maybe won't write about them, but take time. Just take one date at a time and record where you think all of your other family members were, not just your direct line, but those people who were affected. You know, those cousins that you don't see too much anymore, but you still write Christmas cards, I hope, too. Include their context, their ages, and their places and their jobs. Call them and find out where they were at that time, what they were doing. Maybe they'll tell you where someone else was. Maybe you want to talk to your friends when you're at that high school reunion or that college reunion, or take a look at the community reactions, because man in the street interviews were pretty well utilized from about 1930 through the 1980s. You might want to write a paragraph, but if you don't, if you've just got a list, you found some more things, and I guarantee you, finding those things and finding out how someone else reacted or how a community reacted will change you, will add some richness to your life, will make you reflect. And I hope you share those things with people. You can read a book to gain background. A favorite one of mine to read to gain some background about weather changes is Brian Fagan's The Little Ice Age, How Climate Made History, 1300 through 1850. It's a stunner. It's very good. I've given you another one here. Yes, I read theses. This is one out of the University of Edinburgh in 2003. This man used Scottish and Irish records for 1840 through 1850 to find out about epidemics. And he has true lists of people who died as a result of epidemics such as cholera and measles and so on in a community, because frequently, those things struck together. They were not one at a time events. If you look at the 1918 occurrence of influenza in Montana and across the United States, you'll find that we had real epidemics of measles and chickenpox at the same time. We even had some small occurrences of smallpox. And so you'll see the true effect and truly what happened across communities and how people helped one another. Very interesting stuff. Well, that's what I have today. I'm going to see you in October after our Montana State Genealogy Conference, which is here in Great Falls, September 18 through 20 this fall. The speakers are Gina Filbert Ortega and Michael Strauss. He will be talking military and maps, and Gina's going to be doing various things with community histories. You're going to be able to find out a little more out at our Montana site for the Montana State Genealogy Society and Conference, and I'm hoping that I will see you there. In the meantime,
Thanks, Jen. Very good again.
thank you. You're welcome.